Yeah, no, it's okay
So
now. She's
last
happy now.
Friday, I went down to Westminster to witness the global climate protest.
Ah,
And it was pretty fascinating. We actually took my film crew down there
oh,
because we're
good.
making a whole documentary about all sorts of things, from plant
Yeah.
medicine to childhood trauma to you name it. And I went down and I saw all these children protesting. I'd never actually seen that
Yeah.
before. Parents and kids and a lot of 10-year-olds and 14-year-olds, and it was massive. And I'd never seen that. And I just wondered what your thoughts
Well,
were.
I think we'll see. I mean, I'm always skeptical. The fact that young people are involved is particularly important. I
And
was just
new.
having this conversation with a writer, Ian McEwen, who I was talking to yesterday here in England, and you realize that there can be a sea change. The example that always hit me was gay rights. I mean, 15 years ago, the thought that it would just be accepted in the United States to have gay marriage was just impossible. But when I realized what was going to happen when my daughter, maybe this was 20 years ago, and my daughter was a teenager, and she had gay friends, and it was nothing. And I realized for them, being gay was nothing. And then I realized, well, no matter what old white men on the Supreme Court or in Senate think, the next generation, for them, it's nothing. And you can see things change instantaneously when generationally you can produce that change. And what's really becoming clearer, I was more skeptical a year ago, but what's becoming clearer is it does seem to be generational in the sense that it cuts across political lines, that young people are recognizing the impacts and need to respond to climate change in a way that just isn't happening for older people. And when that happens, that means things can change quickly, which they have to, by the way. I mean, it's already in many ways too late because climate change is already happening and having severe impacts. I actually just wrote a piece, which I just got translated into German today, so I re-released it, but it was on the dark side of climate change because there's physical impacts of climate change, sea level rise, storms, and all the things people talk about. But I think almost more worrisome because they are more immediate and may trigger effects that are much scarier for humans across the planet is the socio-political impacts of climate change. And the example I used at the time was a big issue in the United States and to some extent in England, because it's one of the hearts behind Brexit, I think, is question of immigration, of illegal immigration. And as I used to say in Australia, it's nothing. When the Australian government stopped their carbon tax, but at the same time was worried about boat people coming in and they put them on this awful island outside Australia that wouldn't let them come in. I said, well, you have probably 500 million to 1 billion people who are going to be displaced because of climate change in the next 30 years, say. Sea level rise and droughts, or all sorts of things. And where's the nearest place they can go with a lot of empty space? It's Australia. So if you're worried about a few thousand boat migrants, you're going to have a flood of people. And the United States right now, of course, Trump and his wall, and worry about immigration from Central and South America, you can already see that climate change is impacting, producing droughts, and what it causes is people to want to move, especially in agrarian society. So I did the data and pointed out that the same government that's sort of denying or not attempting to do nothing to impact on climate change, in fact, negatively impacting, because one of the ways to get people to not immigrate is to help them grow things where they are. But the aid programs that the United States used to do to help people doing that are being cut back. And so they're worried about 50,000 migrants now, but it's estimated that maybe 10% of the population of Mexico may want to move over the next 40 years because of that impact. So it's called the dark side of climate change, but migration will produce these incredible tensions as it's doing, and that breeds xenophobia. It also breeds unrest in various countries. And so I'm worried about those indirect impacts of climate change in a world that is connected whether we want it or not. And while the physical aspects of climate change can't be stopped, I mean, we've already put in the atmosphere enough carbon dioxide that will last over 1,000 years in the atmosphere to have an impact of a few degrees, okay? So we can, of course, try and curtail it and make it not 5 degrees, that we should be acting. And I'll tell you the reasons why we should act quickly on that. But But what will happen more immediately are the indirect impacts and tensions and wars, and it's poor countries and places that are hotbeds from Bangladesh to Pakistan, and some of those countries like Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and there's all of these indirect effects that we have to realize, and that's why, by the way, in the United States, while certain people may deny the existence of climate change, if you look at the national security community, they've been looking at that and recognizing the reality of it for a long time because they have to. They have to look at the real world, not the world that's trying to be sold to people. And they have to say, what are the security implications and how can we address them?
If like 40 million people try to immigrate.
Yeah, or if it causes social disturbances in a country that has weapons of mass destruction, or countries that are allied, or countries that say become unlivable, but right now provide a significant amount of fossil fuel. I mean, there's all sorts of social of security implications, and they have to look at that.
Right.
And so it's just like Noam Chomsky, who we've had in our podcast as well, and is an old friend for many years, used to tell me when I was a student, did my PhD at MIT, and I would sit in his classes, that if you want to understand what's really happening, read the business magazines and the business pages, because in order for those people to make money, they have to know what's really happening, and they have to. So they're not. There's all this gloss and propaganda that's thrown out. But if you really want to tie into what's really happening in the world, what you really want to do if you can be a successful business person, and so he used to say that, and it's true. If you look at the business or military, you'll see what's really happening.
And can you expand more on this kind of 1 degree or 2 degree versus 5 degree and what we can do and why it's important to act now?
Well, let me first promote. I had a wonderful podcast which already appeared with Dan Schrag, who's a professor at Harvard, a geophysicist, who was actually also. I advised Obama before he became president. I was on that committee, but when he was president, I was an advisor. Right. But Dan was on his council of advisors for 8 years, and he's an expert on climate change. And it's an amazing episode about discussing the physical implications of climate change, and what we might do to deal with it. It is, on the one hand, terrifying, but on the other hand, inspiring, because the point is that by recognizing what's already happened and what is inevitably happening, we do have abilities, technological abilities, to try and deal with things. Not to necessarily reverse climate change. Extracting carbon from the atmosphere would be wonderful, but that's quite a challenge. But to try and find technologies that are going to either mediate it in the future or allow us to change the way we live as a society to deal with the impacts of climate change. But there are Greenland, of course, which Trump wanted to buy, is of great interest because it's. I guess when I first started to get concerned about climate change was looking at the record over the last 500,000 years of sea level rise and temperatures. We can actually correlate those two things by looking at ice cores in the South Pole and other places. We can actually measure the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the mean temperature, and the sea level rise. And sea level has changed by plus or minus, not inches, but 80 meters over that time. And so when you realize that, you've got to say, well, it's true that predictions of global modeling and climate modeling have uncertainties. But when you have the possibility of sea level rise, not by inches, but by meters or tens of meters, you got to ask, is it worth the risk? Is it worth hedging your bets and saying, well, we can't prove that things will necessarily rise by that amount. But here's one example. Right now, the Earth isn't heating up as much as it could because that heat is going into the ocean. The oceans haven't yet equilibrized that heat. But that's good for us right now, but it's bad in the long term because it means that whatever we turn off everything right now, that energy is in the oceans, and the oceans are going to eventually equilibrize that. And a fraction of sea level rise that occurs right now is not from ice melting in Antarctica and Greenland, but actually the fact that it's a simple fact of physics that the coefficient of expansion, that water expands when it gets hotter. So a fraction of the 10 or 20 millimeters of average sea rise that's happened now is just simply from ocean heating. But if we turn everything off, that ocean heating is going to continue, and that because it takes centuries for that energy to equilibrize in the ocean and heat the whole thing up, and Greenland, which already is losing more ice than most models predicted, and could catastrophically lose that ice, because what happens when the water melts on the surface, it goes down below and basically provides a kind of lubricant for the ice to slide off into the ocean. If all that ice disappears in Greenland, you're talking about meters of sea level rise, which is devastating. Now, the first world, in some sense, can deal with it, although Florida is already, I was just reading, Florida, they're already mitigating it. There are places you can't rebuild your house in Florida right now because of sea level rise, okay? And it's going to get only worse. But the rich countries, New York can try and build a moat around it, okay? But Bangladesh or various countries in the South Pacific just can't. And that population, and those are dense, poor populations, and they've got to go somewhere. But here's something interesting. It's a tidbit that I was fascinated by in the podcast. One of the reasons to listen to it or watch it. So global sea levels will rise when the ice melts from Greenland, okay? But interestingly, when the ice melts off the Greenland ice sheet into the ocean, the sea level near Greenland will actually go down. Now, I could give you a quiz. Why would that happen? But I'm not going to do it. There's also you'd be
go back to my physics
Yeah, no.
again.
Well, I would never have guessed it either. It's the gravitational attraction. There's so much mass on top of Greenland and ice that it attracts right now the water towards Greenland. When that ice is gone, that gravitational attraction goes away. So near Greenland, the water sea levels will actually go down. The physics of this is fascinating, if it wasn't, in some sense, terrifying at the same time.